Hey everybody, Scott Brauer, Maki Plastic. Today I want to talk about the story of Maki Plastic and how it kind of became this little thing and kind of an idea that everybody has, this one good idea that's going to set the world of fishing on fire. But then also how it develops into this creation kind of process where everybody's involved in it, and it becomes almost an emulated process where people are now copying what we did to design, develop, and make better things and use our process for how that happened. I know that may sound kind of confusing, but I want to explain that because I think it's an important piece of the story of Maki Plastics. So we started on the side of a, not different than where we're sitting today. It started on the shore of a lake, and we looked at the plastics that were out there in the industry at the time, and they were, just simple shapes. They were, a straight line, something. It didn't have many appendages to it. It didn't, in most cases, look like a bug. It was really merely an action strike. So when you jigged it, it would move well. And it was different than live bait at the time, so that one straight piece would just wiggle out there and sometimes trigger that strike. Well, we started having a conversation on the deck about what if they look like bugs? Like, what if they look like the stuff that hatches and comes off the water in the middle of the summertime? What if it looks like those bugs that when we're catching a fish here and they spit them out into your hand? What if it looked like those things? And can we make that real? Our whole team started looking at that. And me as a teacher, I was teaching mold making within a couple weeks anyways in my classroom because I teach at a technical high school. And so one of the things that I did was I wanted to show my kids how to do something. So I was basically doing mold making within a couple of weeks, and I took that very simple first idea, which is just make a whole bunch of different appendages that stick out. And my first idea was just, what if there was 5 whips that were all on the same hook, and then you put a big thick body that you could hook a hook to, and it would just lay out there and just kind of drive the fish crazy because everything's moving on it. And I said, I'm going to make it look like a water spider. So I cut that mold in front of my kids, and my students said, you know what, this is really cool. What if we want to cut a mold and make a fishing bait? Can we go do that? And then if we do, can we also, catch some fish with it and bring them in and have a fish fry? And that's kind of where Maki Plastics started. I teach the evolution of product design anyways in my classroom, so it was kind of a natural fit into my life. So from this very simple conversation into my classroom, and then also ultimately onto the water, I start to look at how do I design, develop product to make it as easy as it can be for fishermen to both understand and use out there, and then also just continue to drive forward the industry of the plastics revolution. And that really, when you look at evolution, it's almost become a revolution where there's a whole bunch of really good plastics out there. What sets our stuff aside, I think, is how many times it's touched by human hands and human minds and fishermen's hands before it ever becomes a product for you to use out on the market. So, a product, somebody has an idea, and that idea has to go down on paper. And sometimes it's paper, sometimes it's a napkin, and somebody's just sketching me something simple and saying, hey, here it is. Or sometimes it's a picture on my cell phone that shows up and says, what is this bug? And so I start to do some research on it. If it looks interesting enough and we don't have it in our product line, then I'll start to do the research. How many fish actually eat it? And then once they do eat it, how at what point in the, kind of the evolution of the ice season are they eating that bug? And how can we as a company interrupt that process and get more fish in your bucket doing that? So what that looks like is, there's that idea, then there's that picture, and then after that picture, it becomes a CAD drawing, and after that CAD drawing, computer-aided design drawing in a computer, we put it into a CNC machine, and I do all of this work as the owner of Maki Plastic. I think that's one of the things that sets our company aside a little bit. I do most of the sketching. I do most of the, the homework on the bugs and how they work in water and the hydrodynamics behind all of that. and then I cut a mold and I look at the shape and the size and how it's going to move, and ultimately how I perceive the fish are going to address it when they come up and get excited about it or skate back off of it. And so once that happens and we've cut one or two of those, first our cavity molds maybe only have 2 cavities in there, so we're hand making these plastics, all of them, right here in the United States. And so it's easy for me to go from a prototype to production in a fairly short period of time, because these are all American workers that are out there making these baits for me. Those guys are fishing 50 feet away from me right now. My team, Riley and Connor and Luke and Marin and Pam, and all of those people who make Maki Plastic what it is as far as a home business goes, are all here. So we don't have a long lapse in between the process of a drawing to a prototype piece and then ultimately to a finished piece that comes out to you as a fisher person. And so I want to talk a little bit about the story of all of our baits. When you look at why we make so many of them, and Clam we have 12 baits and we have a whole bunch of different colors. And those baits and those colors are because we've picked specifically and strategically, we've picked up these different shapes and sizes because that's what the fish are eating down below. And so at what period of time are we going to make our bait look like that? And then also, because in Clam Pro Tackle, John Crane and Mikey do a great job getting that those jigs together with the story, so that we have the right balance between the jig and the bait. That balance between the jig and the bait is critically important, because if a jig overpowers a bait, where I have in Western New York decided in my mind this is the way this thing's going to look and move, if we don't have the right jig on top of that to make that all kind of work together. So I communicate very clearly and frequently with the design team at Clam, who's creating all of the Clam Pro Tackle, the hardware that is going to be the delivery system that takes those plastics down there. That whole system, works like a cog in a gear in motion, where we do all of those things together simultaneously, so that you can pick up a pack of bait and you can pick up a jig, and we can make it look like 3 or 4 different bugs just by making an adjustment to what we're doing. Yesterday we were at a tournament, and that tournament was literally hurricane force winds almost. It wasn't really that, but it was probably 40-mile-an-hour winds. That's brutal on equipment, but it's even more brutal on your contact with fish. So you've got your rod in your hand, and literally it's blowing line in a circle, so strike indication becomes very tough. When you look at, like this is a Drop XL, when you look at that bait right there, this is going to give you the weight that you need to stay in contact with the fish. Now, if you don't need one that big, obviously we make them smaller too. But again, because they're designed and developed in a parallel state, plastics on one hand, jigs on the other, when everything comes together like that, that's what really we've tried to do with Clam Pro Tackle for you, the end user, to make everything kind of come together and make sense. What does that look like specifically? I talked a little bit about during the bug cycle, during the life cycle that's going on underneath our ice right now. During that life cycle, where do you start as the fisher person to understand what I should have on my lure right then? For me, it looks like first bite is almost always going to be a bloodworm bite, and that bloodworm bite really honestly lasts from the summertime. And so if you're out there scouting your ice and you're scouting your weed beds and you're scouting the rest of it, you should be swinging plastic during that open water period of time. In many stores, when you look at any of the big box or mom and pop shops, it doesn't matter. When you look at them, most of the ice stuff is out by October right now, so you should do a lot of scouting in open water. And we've created these delivery systems that even if there's wind and it's driving you, whether it's, in this particular case, the blade jig or the blade spoon, either one of these two things will get you down there and deliver a bait to the fish, whether you're moving quickly or whether you're sitting over top of them like we are on the ice. But they're great scouting tools in the fall, and you should be swinging those baits during that period of time. So for us, the bloodworm first. Then from there, we're going to move to a year-young profile of some sort. What does that mean? That means bluegills, sunfish, crappies, they all have their babies in that period of time in the summer where they've now become that 1.5 inch, maybe, 3/4 of an inch to 1.5 inch baby bluegill, sunfish, whatever that looks like. So how do we, kind of mimic that and make that happen for each of us as far as baits go? So we can take in this particular case, this is 2 new lures that are coming out for Clam Pro Tackle this year. And this one is a chunky, and we wanted to make a big chunky bait with big movable fins, and it's worked dynamic for us today. We caught some phenomenal fish, and that thing just floats out there when you hang it like this. But again, during that year of young bite, you want to take that same lure. This is a swirl drop, the new swirl drop, and I'm going to deliver that to the fish with this, but all I'm doing is taking that and changing it and making it sideways. So now I've got, instead of those chunky, and you can see it there, instead of those chunky wings being out flat like that and just quivering and driving the fish crazy during that year of young bite, you want to turn it up sideways so it looks like the back end or the body end of a fish. So when a fish is addressing that lure, he's going to come up and see that as the main body, attack that, and again, you're going to be in contact with more fish. That chunky is going to be a very good bait for us. When you look at the evolution of the baits, the poly, the Mackie, all of those baits, and the first one was that water spider I talked about. As we look at all of those baits as they've come forward and that we have in the product line, they each serve a purpose to match the hatch down below in the water table. So on that third bite, where we start to look at a good shrimp bite, where those shrimp are down there and they're vacating down the weeds, because that happens this time during the year, and right now we're in the end of February, March period of time, and because the zooplankton actually lifts up and moves away. Well, that's the food source for shrimp, for scuds. So when you start to see scuds and fish, that means those shrimp are active. Shrimp are always in the water table, but they're not always active in the water table. They stay in those weeds for cover, and they're protected in there, so they like to be there. But when their food goes away, they have to chase it. And so when you're chasing the food chain, the zooplankton, and then the shrimp, and then the baby fish, your young fish are chasing those, and then on top of that, then the whole food chain just continues to get bigger and bigger till your super predators are out there. And for when you would use a shrimp, that's going to be that third heavy feed period. And the reason is, biologically, the fish are now thinking to themselves, I've got to start stacking up all the weight I can have, because I'm going to have to sit on a nest for a period of time. So biologically, their clock is ticking. They know they've got to super feed on these things. It's a great nutritious. Shrimp don't move real fast. There's millions of them in the water, so they're an easy food source for those shrimp. And then out the other end, you want to get more aggressive during that end period of time, so you can start to fish a little bit, add ice out, water starting to wash in, all of the stuff, like from, when you look at where culverts are coming in, and you look at the water. Just yesterday we're in a torrential downpour, all the water going in the hole, those mucky holes. Drop down in those mucky holes, because a lot of times what happens is the current going in will back cut those holes, and all of the aquatic insects that have floated to the top of that ice and frozen in there have now started to release from that, and they're starting to fall down. And again, that's a food driven source, and depending on what you're seeing inside the fish, when you bring it up, take a look at what's in that fish, either by cutting it, throw it in a bucket with a little bit of water, and it'll spit out what it was eating that day. As that occurs, you just want to have enough opportunities in your bucket or in your arsenal, in your bibs, that you can kind of mimic whatever's going on at that particular time. Those changeover period of times, I want to talk to you about another important bait for us coming out next year. It's called the whammy, and this has been a cooperative opportunity for us to develop and design baits, and it really talks to the process of how important you as the end consumer are, and you as the people who are out fishing stuff are important to Maki Plastics. So Kristen Marwin called me up and she said, hey Scott, what do you think about this? My girls really think this would be a great bait. And I said, you know what, I think that's a good idea. I think we'll cut that and let's see how your girls fish it. And so we did. We cut the first shape in the whammy, and then we looked at it and we said, could it be maybe a little bit more versatile if we just made it a little bit different? And so the whammy looks like this in its finished state. And we've cut this mold about 4 times, but one of the things I talked about during the process a few minutes ago was, we'll cut a bait, but we really want a bait to be more versatile. And again, during that period of time where the fish are feeding on a couple of different things, how do you make a bait look like a couple of different things, right? So when you look at, I think I got one right here somewhere. When you look at underneath the water, fish is eating a scud, or they're eating an ant, or they're eating anything, we can just take that on our jig and we can make it look a little different. So if those shrimp that we talked about are swimming, we take it and we can just nip hook it. Nip hook is just right in the front. It's pretty much flat out back. It's basically how everybody would fish something. So if those shrimp are, and this is why when you look at this bait, I've actually made it more narrow here and it goes wider and it's got all those appendages. This rolls just like a shrimp will roll in the water as it's swimming through. That's how it's made, nip hooked. But what happens is sometimes they only want that scud that's down around the weed. And so when that happens, I'll just take that head piece off. So I'll take that piece back here again. When we look at how do we adjust baits on the fly, I'm just going to rip that head off. Please don't throw this on the ice. Be a good steward. Put it in your pocket. Take it home. You can also use it as an ant. So when you look at this thing, if you turn it around the other way after I've cut it out, that's a perfect ant to be fishing with too. So don't throw those extra pieces out, because that may be what the next fish spits out into your hand. So as those fish are now turning over into a scud bite and they're catching, they're right still back in those weeds because they moved off that, then you can take that same bait and you can make it an identical scud going this way, back up and down. So that's that way. That's that way. And a lot of times I'll fish it that way. It also, because you're fishing in the weeds, if you leave that hook on the inside, what happens is when it comes up, it's weedless. So you can drag it through those weeds, and that's where you want to fish it like that, is right inside those weeds. But it'll just drag by the weeds because there's no hook exposed. But when the fish grab onto it, it's going to expose the hook into their mouth, which is obviously what we want to do. And then sometimes, during those late seasons, one of the things I talked about too was the reality of, in late season, you just want a lot of action, a lot of splash, and you want to really get those active fish going after whatever it is you have. This is a swirl drop, one of the new swirl drop kicks. So in the back, we've got the spiky. Up front, we've got the necky. And what the necky does almost every time is it will turn a jig as it falls this way, and it will slow the fall pattern. And then when it flattens out like that, those big crappies can't stand it when that happens. So it'll fall like this, flatten out, and almost always that's where you're going to find that strong, aggressive hit, because those fish are starting to, go into that feeding frenzy to pack on the weight for them to go forward into their next season of having to protect their particular, whatever it is. They got to protect their nests at that particular time in the water system. I want to talk a little bit about some movement baits now. I've talked about a match the hatch in many cases, but I want to talk about, movement baits and kind of how they work a little bit. So again, this is our chunky on the back end of a duckbill, and I made these two lures to go together. I remember I talked about the fact that we, kind of look at these two lures and how can we make them work the way we want them to work. So as this is going to go down into the water table with the duckbill, because it's a mid-body hook, it's meant to jig like this and do kicktails like this when you do it. So it's got that bill that drops in the water and dives. So it's going to almost constantly dive when you're doing this. And then again, when it flattens out. So what that's going to do is it's just going to take that chunky and it's going to kick that chunky tail up. And you can see, kind of how that's going to work. It's going to work just like that, a little bit slower in the water table. Again, when you're looking at action strikes and when you're starting to, kind of wrap your mind around the whole picture that's going on down there, you want to have as many tools in your arsenal as you possibly can, in both shapes and sizes. This is the new ribbon leech spoon. I've got it rigged here with a bloodworm on top. So this is a little bit lighter. It's got a different action than anything else we have. It's a dynamite spoon that we've been prototype testing out here, and I've got it rigged on that with one bloody on the end of it, because I want to get this to rip and then settle into the muck, and then rip and then settle into the muck, and it's going to dive with that. And what's going to happen with this bloody is this bloody ultimately is going to be up in the air like that, and it's going to be waving at the fish, because a bloodworm, when he's in there, he's got to pick his head up to do that. So even with a heavy action bait, you still kind of want to remember, how can I match the hatch and have a heavy movement bait? Because most bugs, most fish, always interact with each other on somewhat of a sight basis and then somewhat of a belief system. The fish have to believe that what it is they're looking at is real, that what it is they're looking at makes them mad on an action strike, And what it is that they're looking at is an actual food source. So one of the things we do with Maki Plastic is we put some of that real food stuff in there. So ours is a pulverized worm, you know, kind of secret sauce. The Mackie sauce is a, you know, kind of this subculture, this whole subculture thing that just makes fish hold onto the bait a little bit longer. The advantage to that is the longer they hold it, the more likely we are, especially as we get older like me, my reaction time's not what it used to be. We want the baits to be held a little bit longer so we can get more fish in our bucket. So that secret sauce, that Mackie juice that we talk about, being on those baits will get those fish to not only, you know, the action of all of the dynamic stuff that we develop in Clam Pro Tackle to work together to help the fish understand this is, it looks right, it's acting right, it makes me mad, and when I finally come up and take a bite out of it, it tastes right. So a lot of times you'll not only get that primary bite, but you'll get that second bite too. And that really is kind of the Maki Plastics story. That's the story of how we develop stuff. That's the science behind what we put into every bit of overthinking so that you as the end user can just pick them off the shelf, go to iceteam.com and look at all the tips and all of the great stories from all of the ice belt. A lot of times, as many times as I think about all of this stuff that's on my waist right now, that's on my legs, sometimes somebody thinks about something that I never even thought of and they send me a picture. Hey Scott, this worked really, really good because I did this. And then I put that into my arsenal and maybe I share a tip on that so that you can do that too. So be creative with baits, break them apart however you want to. There's no wrong way to fish them. You can fish them right out of the pack, or you can break them apart and make them your very own shape. Look at what the fish are eating. Look at how you can make whatever it is you have on your lap look exactly like that. And then ultimately, how do you deliver it to the fish with the jigs that we have in Clam Pro Tackle to make it all three of those pieces work together? At Maki Plastic, that's our story. Our passion, honestly, is making the world's greatest product for you, the fisherman, that you can then feed your family, ultimately, more fish, or you can have more family fun. And that means on the ice, in the pontoon, on your kayak, from the shore. Every product we make for American fisher people, so that you, and Canadian fisher people too, so that you all can enjoy our product line and enjoy your time with your family. Family is what Mackie's all about, always has been. I've always called it the Mackie family from the beginning of time, and I always will. I hope you learn to go out in the outdoors and pay attention to everything that's around you, all of the lessons from fish. And I hope those lessons from fish help you and your family enjoy the outdoors more. Scott Brauer from Maki Plastics.